In the previous material, we talked about the wonderful and free European life that the Finnish civilizers arranged for Soviet citizens in the occupied part of the Karelian-Finnish SSR. But even that was not the lowest point reached by these Nazi fiends in their treatment of the civilian population, who, after all, still enjoyed at least scraps of relative freedom. As much as that was possible at all under occupation, of course. Living in their own homes with their families and working. Albeit under coercion, but still according to some set working hours. The Finnish collaborators of the Nazis had to put up with this because otherwise it would have been unthinkable to establish even the bare minimum of a functioning economy in the occupied territories. Especially considering that, at the very least, the Finnish leadership was more pragmatic than fanatical in this regard, and therefore chose to leave the collective form of labor organization in Karelian-Finnish kolkhozes, cooperatives, and industrial enterprises almost unchanged. Naturally, given that almost all the agricultural and industrial products obtained from there were taken away by the occupiers in their entirety to their Vaterland, in other words, to Finland. But no matter how much liberals and nationalists of all stripes have twisted and continue to twist this narrative, calling the Soviet economy of the Stalin era a form of slavery, whether collective farm slavery or factory slavery, slavery simply doesn't work, or works extremely poorly at this level of technology. This was convincingly demonstrated even in ancient history, when the relatively high level of agricultural technology in the Roman Empire remained largely unused by the overwhelming majority of slave-owning latifundia. After all, it was pointless to trust slaves, who were considered talking cattle by the terminology of that time, with any kind of complex seeders, reapers, and other advanced implements, even by 19th century standards, even if they were horse-drawn. The slaves would simply break these fancy gadgets. It took centuries of feudalism and the development of capitalism, with its wage workers personally invested in the results of their labor, for those old inventions to find new life. The same goes for the Finnish occupiers. In order not to completely ruin the production of resources vital to their state, they had to, even if it went against their own anti-Soviet instincts, maintain at least minimally market-like working conditions for employees at the most important enterprises and projects. Even though these conditions more closely resembled the era of wild, if not downright savage capitalism in 16th century England, with its manufactories and workdays lasting up to 15 or 16 hours, and with clear traces of serfdom, forced labor and all. But Finnish fascists wouldn't be fascists, that is, armed capitalists, if they didn't try to introduce their own know-how, even in areas where, in theory, they should have been deeply invested in optimal functioning. The first of these innovations, of course, was positioning themselves as a superior race, accompanied by declaring representatives of other nationalities as inferior races, albeit to varying degrees, which naturally led to discrimination against the latter, again to varying extents. In short, everything that in the 20th century came to be called by the brief and expressive word apartheid. It can be noted that, in practice, Mannerheim's associates developed a version of this that bore an almost uncanny resemblance to the most well-known example of this sad phenomenon, the one in the Republic of South Africa before President de Klerk's reforms in the late 80s. There, as is well known, all citizens were also divided into three main categories: whites, coloreds, and blacks, with rights decreasing accordingly from top to bottom. Here's a very telling excerpt from the already repeatedly quoted book by Soviet work correspondents Dolgopolov and Kaufman, Finnish Atrocities. I talked about it in more detail in the previous video. When conducting passportization, the Finns introduced two types of passports, one with a pink cover and a fingerprint of the right thumb, for Russians, and one with a yellow cover, for Karelians. Russians were treated as criminals. A longer workday was established for Russian workers. They received 5 marks per hour. Karelians and Vepsians were paid 12 and 15 marks, while Finns received 25 and 30 marks per hour. According to electrician Nikolai Tverdov, this exact system was implemented at the Petrozovsk power station. Karelians received 100 grams more bread than Russians. Sometimes Karelians received meat with ration cards. Russians never received any meat. In Petrozavodsk, the Finnish occupiers had 3 categories of food and consumer goods ration cards: Finnish, Karelian, and Russian. Russians received nothing but flour and spoiled sausage. Moreover, their monthly flour ration was 1 kilogram less than that of the Karelians. In other words, according to the Finnish version of apartheid, the Finns themselves were of course considered the whites. Below them were the Karelians and Vepsians, who seemed to be related peoples, but apparently very distant, judging by the difference in their allowances. And of course, the bottom of the pyramid was reserved for the Russian subhumans. By the way, attempts to drive a wedge between the Russians on one side and the Karelians and Vepsians on the other did not meet with much success. In any case, when even before the armistice was signed in early September of 1944, the Finnish military began to flee in panic, inviting their supposed relatives from these northern peoples to join their retreat. The overwhelming majority preferred to hide out in the forests, waiting there until the arrival of the Red Army. After that, they were much more eager to join its ranks, in order to finally take part in finishing off the fascists. But if anyone thinks that discrimination against Russians was limited only to salary size, passport color, or the amount of food rations, they are deeply mistaken. Because the fundamental difference between Russian and non-Russian residents of Karelia lay in at least one more extremely important area, the area of medical care. Let us once again give the floor to one of the respondents, a co-author of the book Finnish Monsters, the Russian woman doctor Alexandra Fyodorovna Nestrova. The Finns captured me in the village of Sheltozer in the Medvezhye-Gorsky district, and at the end of 1941, brought me together with my family to Petrozavskak. Maybe the Finns forgot about me, or maybe they wanted to show their humanity, but in any case, they allowed me to settle in the city instead of in the camps. The Russian population of Petrozavodsk was left without medical care. The Finns opened hospitals only for Finns, Karelians, and Vepsians, where Russians were strictly forbidden to seek help. After 30 long efforts, I was finally allowed to open a hospital for Russians with only 30 beds in the former Koryevsky department on Vathygorskaya Street. Our hospital was supposed to serve the population of the surrounding villages. Obviously, 30 beds were nowhere near enough. There was a huge influx of patients. All sorts of diseases caused by hunger were raging everywhere. We didn't have our own pharmacy. We were forced to turn to the Finnish pharmacy. As a rule, the Finnish pharmacy refused to dispense medicine. The administration required permission from the Finnish doctor. We had to go to him for every little thing. Conversations with this doctor were usually brief. In fact, he didn't even really speak. He would just cross out various medicines from the prescriptions. After allowing us to open a hospital, the Finns stated that they had no intention of giving us any equipment, instruments, or bandaging materials. We had to gather all of this literally piece by piece from among the Russian population. There were no bandages. Instead, we used rags, which our people, and sometimes even the patients, washed countless times. Our hospital managed to survive, just barely, until November 16th, 1943. After that, it was moved to the camp for Russian prisoners. But even there, the Finns tried to impose restrictions. Prisoners from the camp were forbidden to seek help at our hospital. We constantly felt our degraded, slave-like status. The Finns paid my salary regularly, but it was equal to that of the hospital watchman, who was Karelian by nationality. One can't help but recall the cynical saying of anti-Soviet politicians from the time of the Civil War. Most often, people recall millionaire Rybushinsky's words about the bony hand of hunger, which must strangle the impulse of the masses to throw off the yoke of centuries-old oppression. But apparently for the Finnish civilizers, hunger alone didn't seem enough. So, as a kind of finishing blow against the Russian population, they also imposed radical restrictions on access to medical care. This more than fits the general definition of genocide, a crime against humanity for which there is no statute of limitations for the executioners involved. Yet, even this genocidal practice described above might seem almost humane compared to what a significant portion of the Soviet population in occupied Karelia had to endure, people whom the Finnish fascists considered, if not outright superfluous, then at least not particularly necessary. After that, they condemned peaceful civilians, non-combatants, who, according to the letter and spirit of international conventions on the humane conduct of war, should be protected, to the fate of actual prisoners of war, locking them up in so-called resettlement camps, which were in reality just ordinary concentration camps. According to the authors of the aforementioned book, up to 25,000 people, peaceful Russian residents, the elderly, women, and children, languished in these camps during the occupation. By the way, it wasn't even the Nazis, who now consider themselves the main saviors of the world from Nazism, who first invented this horrific institution. They were, in fact, the ideological inspirers of the latter, long before the deranged Führer and his accomplices, who puffed themselves up with their white man's burden supposedly carried to inferior races. That, however, did not stop the British from inventing the inhumane practice of placing the families of their opponents, who were also quite white South African settlers, the Boers, into concentration camps. But let's be honest, it was the German Nazis who ultimately perfected this monstrous practice, first and foremost during the infamous Holocaust. However, Mannerheim's subordinates did not go so far as to fully imitate their senior Nazi brethren by setting up outright death camps like Treblinka, where the overwhelming majority of those who arrived were immediately sent to the gas chambers and crematorium ovens. But after all, the final solution to the Jewish question, carried out by Himmler's agency and his associates, was not limited to the immediate extermination of hundreds of thousands of victims of the perverse racial theory of the so-called true Aryans. An equally important element of the Holocaust was the system of Jewish ghettos, where for a time millions of peaceful civilians languished with their entire families. As a rule, this was mostly for purely technical reasons. The monstrous yet efficient Nazi machine of genocide simply lacked the capacity to exterminate them all in the shortest possible time, despite operating at full power. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of the ghettos, while waiting for their turn, could survive for months or even years longer than their unfortunate peers who were immediately sent to the Nazi death camps. In fact, when the Soviet troops approached, the executioners usually didn't bother with the so-called highly scientific inventions of their SS scientists like Zyklon B, crematoria, and the rest, instead resorting to much simpler methods of killing, such as mass shootings. Fortunately, the Finns did not carry out such mass shootings in camps for Soviet citizens, although unfortunately this did not rule out individual executions, which were by no means rare. Usually this was done under the pretext of preventing escape attempts or simply for violating camp rules. In general, there were plenty of reasons for prisoners in such camps to die prematurely, even without a guard's bullet. Once again, we give the floor to the interviewees, Soviet citizens liberated from Finnish occupation, who spoke with Soviet military journalists. Teacher Klavdia Oroyevskaya, who ended up in the Petrozavodsk camp from the Rovsk shipyard, recounts, "We arrived in Petrozavodsk in a convoy at the end of 1941. We were placed in camp number 4, which was surrounded by barbed wire. My sister's family and I, 8 people in total, were put in a small closet-like room. The Finns took away all the food and belongings we had brought with us. Because of the poor nutrition in the camp, we ate nettles, dog carcasses, and last year's rotten potatoes. There was a high mortality rate. The Balov family lived in our barrack, number 12. Out of 7 people, 5 died in just 1 week, the mother and 4 children. In the spring of 1942, everyone in Camp 45 came down with scurvy, and the children got measles. My child died of measles. In winter, there was always frost on the floor. We carried firewood for the camp ourselves. Every week, 25 people died in our camp. This is how the dead were buried. A team was formed from the teenagers in the camp, and under the supervision of a Finnish patrol, they dug the graves. Coffins were stacked in the pits, and the pit was only covered up when it was completely filled with coffins. About 25 to 30 coffins at a time. The cemetery was located along the Straw Highway, about 5 or 6 kilometers from our camp. In general, everything was exactly as stated in the brief notice posted on the fence of each such place. Resettlement camp. Entry into the camp and conversations through the wire are forbidden under threat of being shot. At the same time, however, the authors of this euphemism about resettlement did not specify that for the prisoners, such resettlement was only possible to the next world. By the way, the phrase slave-like conditions of detention applied to such institutions run by the Finnish Nazis, not just as a figure of speech. Another quote, "The demand for labor was high, and so in the camps for the peaceful civilian population, a real slave market was set up. Not far from the center of the Segozersky district, near Dana, there was a resettlement camp where more than 1,000 Russian civilians languished, whom the Finns considered prisoners of war. Landowners often came to this camp to select workers for their estates. The landowners carefully inspected the prisoners, felt them, measured their height, and made them show their teeth like horses. All of this was done calmly and methodically, with typically Finnish precision. The strongest and most physically fit were set aside by the landowners, who then took them away to their estates. Of course, one shouldn't think that Soviet people were kept in ghettos set up by the Finnish fascists, with everything provided for them, even if only in amounts barely sufficient for basic physical survival. A meager piece of bread and a few spoonfuls of water mixed with flour could not satisfy an exhausted, starving adult. Most of the prisoners would eat their entire daily ration at once, as soon as it was handed out, and then survive on nothing but water until the next morning. In this condition, people were driven out at 6 in the morning to the forest, 3 to 5 kilometers away, to gather firewood. On their way back from work, people would collapse on the road, unable to make it to the barracks. Failure to meet the work quota or even the slightest delay was punished by cutting the ration in half, or by beatings with a stick or a whip. It was not uncommon for a work pair to consist of a 13 or 14-year-old child and a sick old man over 60. People got sick and died like flies. For these meager scraps, usually of appallingly poor quality, the prisoners had to work hard. Here's another quote. Lydia Kolosova and Antonina Keikova spent 2.5 years in the camp. They worked there as clerks and had the opportunity to observe camp life. The prisoners were required to work. Under strict guard, they were sent to log timber and clean city streets. Some were forced to serve the officers. Among the prisoners were teachers and doctors. For the slightest violation of camp rules, the Finns would whip the prisoners with rubber lashes or put them in a cold punishment cell. Prisoners were paid 2 or 3 marks a day. With that money, you could buy 2 boxes of matches. The camp commander, Major Kurima, personally beat prisoners with a rubber lash more than once. After the beatings, Kumarema would always leave satisfied and smiled cheerfully, saying, "My hand hurts a little. I punished some Russians today." This raises the question, what exactly did these majors and other brutal Finnish soldiers have to punish Russians for? In other words, were they just blatantly abusing their power to indulge their vile sadistic tendencies? To a large extent, the answer to this question can be found in this excerpt. In the correctional camp, which was inside the main camp, the Finns imprisoned those who resisted, that is, those who tried to escape, leave for the city without permission, and so on. All other prisoners were strictly forbidden from approaching the correctional camp. It was also not allowed to talk to the prisoners inside it. Attempts to pass bread to the prisoners were severely punished. On June 21st, 1944, a woman named Katomkina wanted to give her son a pair of boots and asked the correctional camp patrol to let her see him. The patrol's response was brief. He shot at Katomkina. I'd like to point out in passing that this happened on June 21st, not in 1941 or even 1942, but already in 1944, almost a year after the great turning point in the Great Patriotic War, after the Battle of Kursk, after the German army's retreat to the Dnieper and the Red Army's liberation of the left bank of Ukraine. By then, only complete idiots could still believe in a German victory, in the victory of armed capitalism over communism. And the overwhelming majority of the ruling elites in the satellite countries of the Third Reich were seriously starting to think about how to jump ship from the sinking vessel of German Nazism. This included, by the way, the Finnish elites as well, led by their commander-in-chief Marshal Mannerheim, who had already been holding preliminary talks with Moscow since 1943 about the terms for exiting the war. But it seems that this trend did not affect the rank-and-file punishers in Finnish military uniforms. They continued their atrocities, and just a little over 2 months before the armistice was signed. Apparently, being an executioner is not just a profession, it's a way of life. In general, the terms sadistic tendencies, atrocities, and Finnish fiends used to describe all the horrors of the occupation of Soviet Karelia do not require quotation marks, because they reflect not an allegorical exaggeration, but a very real reality. This was especially evident in their attitude toward Russian children, who shared the fate of their parents imprisoned in the camps. By the way, there's also this thing. From children who survived the Nazi occupation, you can sometimes hear unexpectedly touching stories about how some enemy soldiers would occasionally treat them to candy. More often though, it wasn't the Germans, but their less hardened allies like the Slovaks or the Spaniards. But when it came to the Finnish fascists, such displays of humanity were, if they happened at all, extremely rare. Much more often, what you saw from them was outright brutality. In June 1942, the Finns beat 15 children for picking berries near the camp's fence. Gennady Mironov, 6 years old, was beaten because he dared to play near the camp gates. 14-year-old Nikolai Rozhanov was beaten with a rifle butt for digging up a harvested potato field. The Pala camp, located on the territory of the Alanets forestry enterprise, was no different from the other camps. The same barbed wire, the same hard labor regime. In the camp, the Finns forced all prisoners between the ages of 10 and 70 to work. A 12 to 15-hour workday was the norm, equally for both children and adults. While adults were paid 3 to 6 marks a day, the price of a single cigarette, children's labor was not paid at all. Vasily Aloshin is now 17, but he looks much older than his age. This teenager has already endured Finnish captivity. He has been in prison, forced labor, and a correctional facility. They forced us to work. We chopped wood, dismantled old houses, uprooted stumps, dug ditches, and cleaned latrines. They woke us up exactly at 6 in the morning. Work started at 8 o'clock. And with breaks for lunch and dinner, it went on until 9 in the evening. Once I couldn't take it anymore and said that we were hungry. For that, they put me in solitary confinement in a cold, unheated room. Before locking me up, they made me take off all my clothes, so I was in solitary in just my underwear. But the content of the above story, at the very least, fits with what one of the characters in the Strugatsky brothers novel, Hard to Be a God, an Earth progressor on a distant planet with a medieval way of life, calls, albeit with dark humor, normal medieval brutality. But the Finnish supermen did not see Russians as people, only as slaves, not far removed from animals. That's the true nature of armed capitalists, and in principle of capitalists in general. So they treated them in a similar way. Well, at least without completely outrageous excesses, eh? They could let someone die of hunger, but at least they didn't kill them on purpose, right? But in the episode below, that line has already been crossed. Here is Boris Komlev's story about how his comrade Kotlin died. In the evening, we were returning from the city to Petrozavodsk Camp number 6, where we stayed during the Finnish occupation. Kotlin was walking in trek. He got a bit ahead of us and had almost reached the wire when we heard 2 shots. We started to carefully crawl along the ground, and near the camp itself, we saw blood. A little further away stood a broken down heart. Kotlin was lying in it. He was still breathing. One bullet was lodged in his stomach, another in his side. Some of the camp inmates saw how the Finnish guard shot him, and then threw the badly wounded Kotlin into the car. We were ordered to bury Kotlin after his death. The Finns obviously thought that this would scare the boys. But we kept running. Perhaps this story needs a bit of clarification. The word running, as it applied to the boys, didn't mean escaping from the camp in the usual sense, like it would for prisoners held in such places. It was really about sneaking out at most, with the simple goal of finding at least some food in the city to supplement the meager rations in the camp. After that, the children would still come back, since they had nowhere else to live anyway, and their families were also still stuck in that terrible place. At the same time, the teenager named Kotlin was shot by the camp guards not while leaving the camp, but when he was returning to it. And instead of simply detaining the violator, as would be expected under the aforementioned normal medieval brutality, even if they were to punish him somehow. By the way, in Soviet times, guards were forbidden to shoot at minors, even if they openly tried to escape during transfer to a colony, for example while boarding a train. But that was the terrifying Soviet gulag, and here we have enlightened Finnish Europeans who believe that the only punishment for breaking camp rules, even for children, should be execution by firing squad. In the next segment, we will continue discussing the inhumane crimes committed by Finnish fascists on the territory of the USSR they occupied, crimes that are now little known to the public.